This episode features descriptions of violence perpetrated against children and may not be suitable for listeners of all ages. Listener discretion is advised. Beatriz Angelica Mota was the second of two daughters born to her parents, Sandro and Lúcia. Born on February 11, 2008, Beatriz would live with her family on a farm in rural Juazeiro, a municipality that shares a metropolitan area with a larger city nearby. Petrolina was the city where Beatriz and her family spent most of their time. Located in southern Pernambuco, a state known for its agricultural output, Petrolina is a relatively large city in northeastern Brazil, with a population of roughly 350,000, and is located several hundred kilometers inland. While northeastern Brazil has a reputation for being full of crime, corruption, and poverty, the area around Petrolina is a rather rural region with lots of open space and farmland. For Sandro and Lúcia Mota, this was a perfect place to raise their family, especially since they could live on a farm in the middle of the country, but commute to the city every day for work and school. Beatriz and her older sister attended the Colégio Nossa Senhora Maria Auxiliadora, a private Catholic school located in the middle of Petrolina's city center. One of the most prestigious schools in the region, this happened to be where their father, Sandro, worked as a teacher, so the entire Mota family would become intimately familiar with the school and the grounds over several years. Unfortunately, this school also happened to be the location where the life of 7-year-old Beatriz would come to a violent end, in an event that is still surrounded by mystery half a decade later. This is the story of Beatriz Mota. On the evening of Thursday, December 10th, 2015, right at the onset of summer in the southern hemisphere, a graduation ceremony was being held at this private Catholic school in the middle of Petrolina. While the family regularly would have attended the ceremony, due to family patriarch Sandro being an educator there, the family was really celebrating Beatriz's older sister, who was essentially graduating high school. This was a graduation ceremony for older teens who were finishing up their primary school education and would either be advancing to university or moving into the workforce the following year. The entire Mota family would be present for the ceremony, and were all wearing white t-shirts with the face of Beatriz's older sister, in a move that you would expect cheesy families to do during a graduation ceremony. Beatriz and her parents, Sandro and Lúcia, were all wearing the same matching shirts and showed up early at the ceremony that evening to help set things up in the school's auditorium. That evening, hundreds, if not thousands of visitors would fall upon the school to watch their young loved ones graduate and hope that they would be moving on to bigger and better things the following year. If you look up footage of this event, you'll see that there were a lot of people present. With so many people engaged in the festive attitude and live music, it almost had the feel of a concert. And you can see the entire Mota family throughout the ceremony, especially Sandro, Beatriz's father, who was a teacher at the school and was actively participating in the ceremony, giving speeches up on the stage and then posing for photographs with excited students. During the ceremony itself, Beatriz was left in the care of her mother, Lúcia, but was moving around quite a bit. In some of the footage, you can see her sitting with her father and the other staff members up front, and in other footage, you can see her sitting next to her mother in the auditorium seats, or running around with a younger friend of hers. She appears to be a jittery child, having to sit through an hours-long graduation ceremony, as you would expect from any 7-year-old. Beatriz was last seen by her mother at around 10 p.m., while the ceremony was still in the swing of things. A few minutes later, Beatriz told her mother that she was going to get a drink from a nearby water fountain out in the school's courtyard, and then left to do so. This was a distance of roughly 50 meters, so it wasn't like she was going far. However, minutes would pass without Beatriz returning, and Lúcia would begin to look for her daughter. Footage shows the mother looking throughout the auditorium and surrounding area, looking for her now missing 7-year-old to no avail. By the time that Sandro broke free from his participation in the graduation ceremony, at around 10:25 p.m., he learns that Beatriz has not been seen in several minutes. Since this was a private school, with security guards and only one way in or out, for non-staff members. The parents don't start to panic quite yet, but do begin to seriously search for their missing daughter. At around 10:43, Sandro takes to the stage, pausing the band that's playing to call for his missing daughter. He says to the audience while pointing to the shirt that he is wearing, which bears the face of his oldest daughter, "Beatriz, my daughter, where are you? Hey Bea, everyone is looking for you, my love. She is dressed like me here, with her sister's face." While this announcement would fail to have the necessary effect, Beatriz would remain missing for several minutes. It would galvanize a lot of the staff members of the school to begin looking for the girl. Minutes later, a distraught-looking Sandro returns to the stage, telling the crowd that Beatriz is a 7-year-old who was playing with a classmate when she was last seen. "I've already looked everywhere I can think of in this school, and I still haven't found my daughter. I'm desperate." At this point, staff members and other worried parents had begun scouring through the school, looking for Beatriz, as Sandro gave his second address over the PA system. As Sandro pleaded for help to find his missing daughter, a commotion can be heard outside of the school's auditorium, a mix of screams and cries, full of anguish. The body of Beatriz Mota had been found by a security guard inside of a mostly empty closet next to an abandoned gymnasium at the school. A fire caused by students just months prior, in October of 2015, had led to this part of the school being closed off, but a security guard had wandered into this part of the school in search of the missing child. He had found her in the back corner of this burned out closet, amidst some excess junk left behind, some rags, cleaning supplies, and a half-filled cabinet. Police would be called out to the scene just moments later, as families began to leave the graduation ceremony amidst this tragedy. Several dozens of people would remain behind at the scene, however, to console the family of the girl and give statements to investigators, who began to arrive just after 11 p.m. A collection of authorities would begin to arrive at the scene that evening, including members of both the military and civil police. Throughout Brazil, the military police traditionally uphold the law, while the civil police conduct investigative matters. So in essence, they would work in tandem to close off the crime scene, collect statements, and then begin their investigation. Over the next day or so, they would be joined by authorities from the state police headquarters in Recife, as well as members of the Institutes of Legal Medicine and Criminalistics, who would weigh in on specific matters regarding the crime scene and evidence. Early on, it was decided that the crime would be overseen by Delegate Sarah Machado, who, as a delegado, would act in a role similar to that as a magistrate or prosecutor while overseeing these numerous law enforcement agencies. Over time, however, Machado would prove to be just one of the many delegates that would oversee this investigation, and would be replaced by Marcion Ferreira Jacinto by the end of December. The discovery of 7-year-old Beatriz Mota's body in the burned-out closet next to the abandoned gymnasium was particularly haunting for those that made the discovery, having never seen a crime scene like this before in their lives. After police arrived at the school, the scene was roped off, and the child's body was taken to Juazeiro, the city adjacent to Petrolina, where the autopsy was later performed. There, it was determined that Beatriz had been stabbed dozens of times, in the chest, stomach, and along her arms and legs. Her autopsy would note a total of 42 stab wounds, which then Delegate Sarah Machado claimed had come at the hands of a killer that was, quote, full of rage, unquote. Originally, it was speculated that the motive for killing Beatriz had been personal because of this overkill, and it seemed like this crime had been caused by some kind of emotional motive. The murder weapon, a knife, was found at the crime scene, having been left half buried in the abdomen of the young victim. While reports in the local media would describe this as a fillet or fishing knife, photos of it appear to look like a regular butcher knife, which appeared slightly old with a wooden handle. Surprisingly, there was no sign of any sexual assault having taken place. According to police, there was no proof that the killer had pursued Beatriz for any sexual motive, having just killed her and disposing of her body in this closet. But that made the crime even more bizarre, as it gave no apparent motive for this killer to have targeted an innocent child. killed, while investigators would state early on that Beatriz had been killed where her body was found, due to there being no sign of blood outside of the closet, indicating that she had not been carried or dragged to the closet post-mortem. But this would come into dispute months later when investigators began speculating about the killer or killers. During the autopsy of Beatriz's body and the examination of the crime scene, multiple samples would be taken by authorities. This included fingerprint, hair, and blood samples from the body and the murder weapon, as well as skin samples taken from the child's fingernails, which authorities hoped would lead them to a potential suspect in the future. As all of this information was being documented, police would begin a total canvass of the area around the crime scene, not only attempting to speak to everyone that had been at the graduation, which by some estimates had been upwards of 2,000 people, but also people that had been in the surrounding area that night. Since this school was in the middle of a relatively busy city center, you can guess correctly that this was a decent amount of people. Because Beatriz had been one of the few younger children at this event, many of the witnesses were able to recall having seen her. Some were even able to recall seeing her in the area of the water fountain in the school's courtyard, where, if you recall, she had been heading right before she originally went missing. Her body was later found nearby the abandoned gymnasium, close to the water fountain, and it was believed that the killer was an opportunist that grabbed her near there and then took her to an isolated spot to end her life. In addition to collecting witness statements from the region, police would also begin the lengthy process of compiling video footage from the school and neighboring businesses. The school itself had some security cameras, along with motion sensors, but would prove to be essentially useless during the investigation itself. Footage from the school, stored on an external hard drive, would become corrupted early on, but regardless, the area around the gymnasium, where the body of Beatriz had been found, had no working cameras. The security cameras there had been damaged by the fire from months earlier, and were no longer working. This meant that investigators would have to rely mostly upon external footage, as well as footage shot at the graduation ceremony. In addition to parents and other relatives of the graduating students, who might have been recording or taking photos throughout the ceremony, it was discovered that a professional film crew had been hired by the school to record the graduation. Everyone involved was asked to forward their footage or photographs to the police, so that they could begin to reconstruct the specific series of events that had led to the death of Beatriz Mota, and hopefully build a cohesive timeline. This would all unfold behind the scenes over the next several weeks, as investigators hoped to identify a person of interest from the footage. Through the vast amount of photos taken and the footage recorded at the school's graduation ceremony, investigators were able to trace the whereabouts of 7-year-old Beatriz Mota and her family members pretty cohesively throughout the night. Throughout most of the ceremony, Beatriz could be seen sitting next to her family. At 8:10 p.m., she was recorded sitting next to her father Sandro among the staff members at the front. At 9:55, students are continuing to receive their diplomas, and Sandro is called to the stage. When the camera pans to him, you can see 7-year-old Beatriz sitting next to him. At around 10:02, Beatriz gets up and moves to sit closer to her mother, Lucia, and would remain in that area for the next few minutes. The last footage investigators could find of Beatriz came from 10:09 p.m., which shows the girl walking away from her mother, heading towards the water fountain in the school's courtyard. This is where she would last be seen alive by any witnesses moments later, and fits in with the timeline investigators would establish, with Beatriz disappearing at around this time. From here, there exists no additional footage with the girl, with her death likely coming over the next few minutes. At around 10:25, family members can be seen in the auditorium looking for Beatriz. At 10:43, Sandro goes up on stage to address the audience, and almost all of the footage cuts out just minutes later, with the discovery of the girl's body at around 10:50. Because of the location that the body was found, in the burnt-out closet near the gymnasium, it was speculated that the killer likely had some kind of familiarity with the school. He likely knew that this area would be dark and abandoned, and maybe even knew that there were no working security cameras in that corridor, making it a blind spot for authorities, and the perfect place for him or them to commit this vile act. While additional footage discovered later on would reveal how this individual had entered the school, there exists no footage whatsoever of him having left. which indicates that he managed to get out without being noticed by anyone. This again indicates some familiarity with the school. However, it is believed that multiple witnesses had seen this killer inside of the school that night, in the moments both before and after the crime happened, but they did not know anything was afoul at the time. Among these witnesses were none other than Beatriz's mother, Lucia, who was desperately focused on finding her daughter. In February of 2016, roughly 2 months after the murder of Beatriz Mota, police would release a digital sketch of a potential suspect, which they claimed they had developed after speaking to multiple eyewitnesses. All of these witnesses claimed to have seen this individual near the water fountain, where Beatriz had last been seen alive, and included the victim's own mother, who had been frantically searching for her at this time. One of these witnesses had seen this man sitting on a bench near the water fountain, taking a drink just as this person approached. In retrospect, they think that this individual had likely just been sitting and waiting there, but feigned taking a drink to avoid suspicion at the time. At least one witness would claim to have seen this man in the woman's bathroom, although I can't find any more information about this, which I think should have raised alarms at the time. Another witness, who police described as their most important yet, saw this man emerge from the area where the body of Beatriz was later found, near the abandoned gymnasium, which was shrouded in darkness at the time. A witness would then see this man in the men's bathroom a short time later, washing his hands and face, but thought nothing of it. According to Sandro, the father of Beatriz, this individual had approached at least 2 other children that evening, asking them to help him carry a table into the auditorium where the graduation ceremony was being held. However, while this scheme to lure children into the corridor near the gymnasium had not worked on 2 other kids, it had eventually worked on 7-year-old Beatriz, whose kind and innocent nature turned her into a victim. She had likely gone along with this individual willingly, ultimately being stabbed 42 times and then abandoned in a burned out closet. However, the fact that this individual had attempted to lure 2 other children into the corridor indicates that Beatriz had not been intentionally targeted, but rather fell prey to an opportunistic predator. The digital sketch of this individual came in the form of an e-fit, which investigators had spent more than a month crafting with the assistance of these numerous witnesses. According to the e-fit, this man stood between 1.65 and 1.7 meters tall, about 5.5 feet, weighed around 70 kilograms, about 155 pounds, and had moderately dark skin. As far as facial features are concerned, this man had deep-set eyes, severe or stern-looking features, and a prominent brow. At the time of the crime, this man was wearing dark blue jeans and a green shirt with a collar. Because of this, he would eventually become known as the Green Shirt Man, or the Man with the Green Shirt in the press. None of the witnesses had seen this man leave the school that evening, leading to a theory that he might have lingered around the school for some time. For that reason, police continued to look through the available footage in the hopes of creating an airtight window for this mysterious individual. Just days after releasing the e-fit digital sketch of this unknown person, investigators floated the idea of there being multiple suspects. This seemed to be due to there being 2 unidentified DNA samples recovered from the crime scene, one of which came from the murder weapon, the knife, as well as another found underneath Beatriz's fingernails, on her right dominant hand. Both samples seemed to come from different males who were not related, and the existence of 2 prominent DNA samples on the victim's body indicated more than one killer. Because of this, authorities would begin to publicly speculate that more than one person had been involved in the murder of 7-year-old Beatriz Mota, having killed her in a separate location and then transporting her body to the closet that she was later found in. In the years since, investigators have not clarified about where they think Beatriz was murdered, but have continued to insist that she was not killed inside of that closet, seemingly refuting what they had said early on about there being no sign that she was carried or dragged into the closet. The following month, March 2016, police announced that as many as 5 people might have acted together to carry out this murder, and this included school officials. Authorities would publicly allege that these 5 individuals had allowed 3 sets of keys to disappear. Sets of keys that allowed access to the school's internal and external doors and gates. These 3 sets of keys had been reported missing on November 25th. roughly 2 weeks before the murder, and authorities speculated that this was evidence of premeditation. Investigators would also allege that the lights that had been turned off in the corridor leading to the old gymnasium, where the body of Beatriz had been found, had been done so intentionally. To them, this was proof that the murder had been carefully planned and executed, as the turning off of the lights neutered the effect of the security cameras in that area of the school, rendering them useless to authorities. Adding on to all of this, authorities began publicly floating the idea of this crime containing a very tight window of opportunity, 20 minutes at the most, from when Beatriz had disappeared to when her parents had started to search for her, and this, they alleged, indicated that the killer had likely received help in the commission of this crime, possibly even from school officials. While authorities would withhold the names and ages of these 5 individuals, they would float details about them to the press. All but one were male school employees, who had seemed to lie or mislead investigators about certain details during their official interviews. One was described as being nervous around the time of the crime. At least 3 had denied being in the area of the crime scene, which investigators believed was refuted by video evidence. And another, a security guard, was seen on video abdicating his duties on the evening of the graduation ceremony. Despite these 5 individuals being publicly suspected of involvement, or at the least attempting to obfuscate their role in this case, there was no evidence specifically linking them to this crime. Almost all of the information released by authorities appeared to be incredibly circumstantial, and some in the media picked up on that, claiming that the police were basically just throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck, in essence conducting the modern-day equivalent of a witch hunt in the hopes that it could catapult their case into something greater. While none of these 5 school staff members would ever be charged with any crime related to this case, they would be fired from their positions in the ensuing weeks. Regardless of their intentions or not, police had successfully incepted the idea of a murderous conspiracy into the Brazilian zeitgeist. And that would be very hard to shake in the coming months as the murder investigation continued. Meanwhile, within that time, a prosecutor attached to the case began publicly speculating that Beatriz had been killed inside of the private Catholic school for some kind of bizarre religious motivation, hinting at there being some kind of underlying motive tied to satanic or black magic rituals. As you can imagine, he could offer up no insights to prove that, making this just the second unfounded allegation in as many months, which did an untold amount of damage to the integrity of the case moving forward. Months later, authorities would unveil their largest piece of evidence yet, surveillance footage of a suspect who could be seen walking around and into the school during the period in which the crime had been committed. This footage was taken from businesses and other buildings in the surrounding area, in the block or so around the school grounds, and spanned a longer time period than expected, nearly 2 hours in total. This individual, the aforementioned man in the green shirt, was seen walking around the school at around 8:30 p.m., which was right when the graduation ceremony was just getting started. He is easy to follow in this footage because of the unique way that he walks, with a noticeable lurch or gait in his step. But instead of walking towards the school, he simply skirts around the outer walls and then heads off in the opposite direction, before eventually returning to the area about an hour later. Roughly 1 hour and 9 minutes after leaving the neighborhood, this green-shirted man returns to the area around the school and seems to pull out a cell phone. In the footage, you can see him engage in a phone conversation with someone for a moment, and then just a short time after the call, he reaches down to the street and pulls a knife out of nowhere from the curb. This knife, which is undoubtedly the murder weapon later recovered from the crime scene, is then tucked inside of his sock as he continues into the school itself. The man in the green shirt arrives at the school at around 9:45 p.m., roughly 15 to 20 minutes before Beatriz Mota would first go missing. He then makes his way around a security guard by blending into a crowd of people near the entrance. From there exists no additional surveillance footage, but brief glimpses of this man exist from footage of the ceremony itself. The man walks through the auditorium where the graduation was being held, heading towards the school's courtyard where the water fountain was, which Beatriz would head to just minutes later. In a sad irony, The suspect can be seen in images and footage taken of the ceremony, as the father of Beatriz, Sandro, is seen smiling and posing for photographs with graduating students. Unfortunately, there exists no footage of this mysterious man from this point, but this is where multiple witnesses would recall seeing him. This includes Lucia, the mother of Beatriz, who began looking for her daughter just minutes later. Despite this footage showing how the man gained entry into the school, him taking a phone call on his cell phone before picking up the murder weapon along the street, and him making his way into the courtyard that Beatriz Mota disappeared from, there exists no footage of this man leaving the crime scene. From here, his trail seems to go cold, with him not leaving the crime scene through the main entrance. As far as investigators can tell, he seems to have disappeared into thin air, or at least, he took another exit that wasn't covered by any cameras, seemingly giving credence to the theory that he knew more about the school than a random killer would. That information, paired with him being in the area hours before the crime, taking a phone call before entering, and then picking up a knife along the street, led investigators to think that this was a fully thought out, premeditated crime. But the motive continued to elude them. Why would someone seemingly target children? Through numerous witness statements, it became clear that Beatriz wasn't the main target of this individual. After all, he had accosted at least 2 other children before her, and seemingly settled upon her as a victim because she had gone with him to a dark and isolated location. But why had he been so prepared to carry out this crime, in a school filled with hundreds of people to boot? And where had he gone afterwards? These questions remain unanswered to this day. Following up on the release of this surveillance footage, authorities would reveal another startling piece of evidence months later, in March of 2017. This time, they would release images and footage from the school's security system, footage that authorities had previously claimed to be corrupted, but had been sent out of the country to the US Federal Bureau of Investigation to be augmented. This footage provided the clearest image of the suspected killer to date, the individual known as the man in the green shirt, who had been identified by multiple witnesses early on and then picked out of other surveillance footage as the killer. While this wasn't a definitive image of this individual, it could feasibly be compared to potential suspects in the future to eliminate those that didn't fit his profile. While this footage provided a good look at the suspect's face and likeness in better detail than ever before, which came along with a lot of fanfare from authorities, it would ultimately prove to not be the smoking gun that investigators hoped it to be. Over the next couple of years, the turnover at the top of the investigation would continue, with Delegate Glide Angelou taking over the case in December of 2016, and then being replaced by Francisca Neri the following November. She would become the 4th delegate to oversee this case in less than 2 years, and would remain the longest tenured among them, but would eventually prove fallible herself. This frequent turnover came after protest from the parents of Beatriz Mota, who had become increasingly jaded with the investigation over time, viewing the prosecution's lack of clarity on speculative information as a hindrance. After the switch to the 4th delegate, Sandro and Lúcia even began stating in press releases that they'd be better off with a private investigation than one marred by so much public dysfunction and speculation. Over the next year or so, this wedge between the family of Beatriz and authorities would continue to widen, with Sandro and Lúcia seeming to take an antagonistic tone towards the investigators overseeing this case, claiming that certain investigators had sought to enrich themselves due to their work on it, permanently sullying the case as a result. In at least one instance, an investigator for the police had left the force to become a security contractor, and used his knowledge from this case to provide security information to the school where Beatriz had been murdered. They claimed that the case was rife with these kinds of conflicts of interest, and that police had not sought to solve the crime as they should have. It wasn't until the final half of 2018, 3 years after the murder, that the story began to gain some momentum in the press yet again. That was when police identified an individual as having potential involvement in the crime, a man named Alison Henrique de Carvalho Cunha, who had been one of 2 outsourced IT workers employed by the school at the time of the crime. While Henrique wasn't suspected of being the killer, the police publicly accused him of having lied to them during questioning, as well as intentionally erasing security footage from the school's servers in January of 2016, less than a month after the murder. Authorities alleged that this contained footage of the killer, which it was assumed was ultimately released the following year, being the footage from March of 2017 that had been augmented by the FBI. In December of 2018, authorities issued an arrest warrant for Henrique, but he would manage to avoid captivity and decided not to turn himself into authorities. Search warrants would be carried out at his home, where his wife and children continued to live, but was unable to find anything that incriminated him in this crime. Henrique would remain wanted over the next several months, becoming a fugitive in the process. Lawyers for the man claimed that this was nothing more than a bullying tactic by police, who wanted to peg him as a scapegoat to make up for their own failures. Henrique's attorneys allege that it was the police who had mishandled those hard drives, resulting in the footage from the school becoming corrupted, and that it had nothing to do with Henrique or his work in IT. After all, they state, he had owned and operated his own IT business for over a decade, and had no kind of prior criminal record. His lawyer stated that any attempt to vilify him for the police's failures was akin to corruption. At this point, it's worth pointing out that Allison Henrique is not suspected of being the killer in this case. After all, he didn't work at the school itself, but at a separate location where he managed his IT company, which just so happened to handle tech matters and server management for the school. Despite authorities alleging that he had lied during questioning and erased surveillance footage, a judge would revoke Henrique's arrest warrant in 2019 due to a lack of evidence. An investigation into his potential involvement continues to this day, but seems to be based more on hearsay and conspiratorial gossip than anything. To date, the murder of Beatriz Mota remains unsolved, with the motive for the crime being perhaps the largest unexplained facet of it. The security footage compiled by authorities reveals a man walking around the school hours before the murder, and then returning just minutes before Beatriz would go missing. This man seemed to arrive at the school, speaking to someone over the phone, and then picking up a knife, which had been hidden outside of the school for some reason. After hiding the knife in his sock, this man then sneaks into the school through a public entrance and then lingers around in the area of the water fountain for 10 to 15 minutes. During that time, he attempts to lure at least 2 other children into an isolated area and seems to have found success with 7-year-old Beatriz, whose naive nature made her an easy victim. To me, this indicates that this wasn't a planned crime, at least not in the traditional sense. Because this unknown individual seems to have attempted to lure at least 2 other children into the corridor where the body of Beatriz Mota was ultimately found less than an hour later, it indicates to me that she was not the intended target. In fact, there likely wasn't an intended target, no matter how staged this crime might have seemed. Plus, how could this individual have foreseen Beatriz leaving her parents behind to fetch a drink of water? That just seems very unlikely to me. While none of this explains why this unknown individual picked up a knife along the street, which seems to have been hidden away for this specific crime, or why he had spoken on the phone just moments before entering the school, these could very easily be red herrings. It's very possible that this crime was planned out by multiple people, but all we know is that a very sick individual was looking to kill someone. With that being said, this individual does seem to have expressed intimate knowledge of the school itself, knowing where to go during the graduation ceremony, and seeming to know which areas of the school would be abandoned. I find it highly unlikely that someone would be able to enter a school and find an empty corridor like this one, with the abandoned gymnasium and the burned out closet, without knowing the inner workings of the school itself. After all, this took place during a graduation ceremony with hundreds, if not thousands of people inside. The sheer audacity to carry out this crime then implies some knowledge of the school's inner workings, as does the killer's ability to exit the school without being caught by any security cameras nearby. Unfortunately, this dichotomy between the crimes seeming to appear random yet premeditated at the same time leaves a lot to the imagination. Either remain possible, and it makes sense why this case in particular would inspire a lot of conspiratorial or ritualistic theories, because at the end of the day, those seem like some of the only rational explanations for why this killer acted the way he did. The body of Beatriz Mota was originally buried in Juazeiro, on a plot near her family's farm, but the body was later transferred back to Petrolina, the city where she had been murdered. The family explained that the reason for this was so her body could be closer to family and friends that wanted to pay respect, as well as them wanting to build a shrine in her honor. After all, they wanted to remind the city that the crime happened there, right in the middle of Petrolina itself, and nothing that happened in the future could change that. Authorities have stated that they have attempted to match the DNA from the 2 samples found at the crime scene to dozens of potential suspects, but none have proven to be a match as of yet. Despite that though, they continue to hope that forensic analysis can provide a breakthrough in this case. Just earlier this year, in March of 2020, the 4th delegate in charge of the investigation, Francisca Neri, was removed from this case and replaced with a task force of delegates, who were in turn appointed by the head of the state civil police. It seems like this was a concerted effort to avoid the political ramifications that a single delegate had caused in the past, but this decision was critiqued by the Mota family as a continued symptom of the systematic dysfunction, as opposed to a cure. Nearly 5 years after the vicious murder of this 7-year-old, her case remains very much unsolved, with several details being held close to the vest by investigators. This is much to the chagrin of the parents of Beatriz, Sandro and Lúcia, who continue to call for justice daily, in addition to engaging in protest, sit-ins, and even hunger strikes to raise awareness for this case. They took their disagreement with authorities to another level just last year, 2019, when they began a crowdfunding campaign to start their own, separate, private investigation. In the months since, after starting their own parallel investigation, the parents of Beatriz Mota have critiqued the ongoing police investigation, which they claim bungled the case early on, by not only mishandling evidence but potentially compromising the crime scene due to failed standards and procedures. They believe that the case should be handled by federal authorities, and actively petition for the case to be ripped away from state officials. In the meantime, they continue their own investigation, without the frills of a bureaucracy that they have come to despise, as they continue to search for answers in the case of their murdered daughter, who has now been dead for nearly as long as she was alive. Sadly, Beatriz Mota is not a name that many people in the Northern Hemisphere are familiar with, due primarily to the language barrier that exists between Brazil and the rest of the world. Brazil is one of the few nations that predominantly speaks Portuguese, while the nations around them primarily speak Spanish. However, throughout the region that this case happened in, northeastern Brazil, this case has become similar to the John Benet Ramsey murder, a shocking crime that galvanizes the public behind a common cause and highlights inefficiencies in the criminal justice system. However, in doing so, it becomes easy for authorities to point fingers at outsiders, the ever-present other, which then allows scapegoats and conspiracies to be created out of thin air. This was a very savage and brutal crime perpetrated against a child who, at the end of the day, has become overshadowed by her mysterious death. Her life came to a sudden and violent end in December of 2015, and in the years since, her killer has managed to avoid any culpability for his or their actions. However, with recent advances in forensic science, I don't see that lasting much longer. As recently as this year, 2020, investigators have hinted at a possible suspect residing in Piauí, a neighboring state to the northwest of Petrolina. Due to this information, I believe that investigators know who likely committed this crime, but they haven't been able to build a case against him yet. Until such a time, the story of Beatriz Mota remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to Unresolved. This case has been one of the hardest for me to research in the nearly 5-year history of this podcast, primarily because the entire story is set in Brazil, so almost every source is in Portuguese. For that reason, Google Translate really deserves an assist on this episode. However, a lot of the reporting is also pretty sensationalized, so that ended up obscuring a lot of the information I was looking for. And for the record, I don't speak or read Portuguese, so hopefully I didn't bungle the pronunciations too badly. The story itself is just so sad and bizarre, and if you want to try and stay up to date in this story, try and find the Facebook group Somos Todos Beatriz, which roughly translates to We Are All Beatriz. You can install the Google Translate extension on Google Chrome or Firefox to auto-translate everything, and you could follow along with that group at least. But hopefully there will be a more comprehensive update in the case in the very near future. Anyhow, I have been your host, Micheal Whelan, and each episode of the show is researched, written, hosted, and produced by myself. The score is also composed by myself through Amper Music, except for the song you're hearing now, the Unresolved theme song, which was written and composed by Ailsa Traves. For a full list of sources and references, please head to the podcast website, unresolved.me, to learn more. Every month, this show is supported by an incredible group of people over on Patreon. To join them, just head over to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, or search for Unresolved on the Patreon app, and you can gain access to a wide assortment of perks, including a producer credit. This week, the wonderful producers are Maggie James, Roberta Jansen, Ben Crocombe, Peggy Bellarda, Quill Carter, Victoria Reed, Gabriella Bromley, Laura Hannon, Damian Moore, Amy Hampton, Stephen Wilson, Scott Meesey, Marie Vangland, Scott Patzold, Astrid Nair, Lori Rodriguez, Aimee McGregor, Danny Williams, Sydney Scotton, Sarah Moscaratolo, Sue Kirk, Thomas Ahern, Seth Morgan, Marion Welsh, Patrick Loxo, Kelly Jo Hapgood, Alyssa Lawton, Jared Midwood, Travis Sepko, Meadow Landry, Rebecca Miller, Tatum Bautista, Joe Wong, Aaron Piles, Tunya Elzinga, Consuelo Moreno, Jacinda B., Ryan Green, Stephanie Joyner, and Dawn Keller. Thank you all so much. Your support truly does mean the world to me, as does simply listening to this podcast. Thank you all. I'm hoping to release a few more episodes of Unresolved before taking a brief hiatus. If you missed the announcement in the last episode, I'm going to be moving from Virginia all the way out to Anchorage, Alaska. But until then, I'm going to keep recommending some podcasts at the end to keep you all entertained and informed in my absence. And in following the tradition set in the last episode, I'm going to recommend one serious podcast and one more fun podcast. My serious recommendation is Already Gone, hosted by my friend Nina Instead, which covers cases similar to those on Unresolved. Nina is an amazing narrator and researcher who beautifully tells the story of missing and murdered people. She also has a separate show called Don't Talk to Strangers, which is a deep dive on the Oakland County child killings and is similarly well done. Check out both of those, as well as my next recommendation, podcast 1289. Y'all might have heard me talk about 1289 before, but it's a show that makes fun of everything. Ghost stories, alien abductions, hucksters and flim-flam artists, conspiracies, and so much more. It's a show that's really informative while also being hilarious, and I'd recommend it for anyone looking for a change of pace in their podcast playlist. Once again, that's podcast 1289, just podcast 1289. Anywho, I'll be back with another couple of recommendations next week, when I'll be covering my first internet-related mystery in quite a while. But until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you all later.